How are animals who are raised for human consumption treated, and why should we be concerned about this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Most people would be really deeply offended and would not want to support the animal agribusiness industry if they actually knew how animals who are raised for food are treated and are raised and are killed. There are virtually no laws that are really protecting these individuals. And, in just one day, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. And there is, I mean, just think about that number for a second. It is absolutely staggering. There is no way that this process could ever be anything other than highly violent and brutal. And even if it were, even if the number were lower, obviously there would still be violence involved because animals are being raised and killed for their flesh and other body parts. Most people do not know what's actually happening in animal factories and even in so-called, smaller farms. And this is a key reason why well-intentioned people who are compassionate, people who care about animals, people who certainly care about justice and would never want to contribute to harm toward another individual unnecessarily. This is why these same people nevertheless support an industry that really runs counter to their core moral values of compassion and care, which is caring, and justice, which is fairness.
What is carnism?
Carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. But the only reason that we may learn to eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity for survival, which is true for many people in the world today, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. But most people who eat animals don't recognize that they even have a choice. They're even making a choice when they eat animals because carnism is invisible. They don't recognize this belief system or ideology for what it is. Now, carnism is a particular type of belief system. It is a dominant system. That means that it's invisible. It's woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And it's embraced and maintained by all of our major social institutions. So, when we study nutrition, for example, we're typically studying carnistic nutrition, but we don't recognize the carnistic bias because the system that gives rise to this bias, carnism, is invisible. And when we're born into a dominant institutionalized system such as carnism, we inevitably internalize that system. That means we learn to look at the world through the lens of the system. So, and carnism is structured, it is a violent system. This is the other aspect of carnism that I wanted to talk about. It's a violent system, an oppressive system. It's literally structured around violence. Meat cannot be procured without killing, and egg and dairy production cause extensive harm to animals. In fact, one could argue that they're the most brutal of all carnistic industries today. And most people, as I said earlier, would never support this unnecessary, intensive violence against other sentient beings. And yet they do eat animals. And so systems such as carnism basically need to convince people who share these core moral values of compassion and justice to act against their values and to act against their own interests and the interests of other individuals, in this case, farmed animals, without fully realizing what they're doing. In other words, carnism teaches us how not to think and feel when it comes to those animals we've classified or we've learned to classify as edible. And carnism exists, it's a global phenomenon, right? So it's, people around the world, in mediating cultures around the world, they learn to classify a small handful of animals as edible, and all the rest they learn to classify as inedible and often not only disgusting, but offensive to consume. So even though the type of animal consumed changes from culture to culture, members of all cultures tend to see their own choices as rational and the choices of other cultures as irrational and often disgusting and even offensive. And so what carnism essentially does is carnism uses a set of psychological defense mechanisms. These defense mechanisms distort our perceptions of meat, eggs, dairy, and the animals we've learned to classify as edible, and disconnect us from our natural empathy from these individuals, for these individuals, so that we consume them without realizing what we're actually doing. So for example, if you were sitting down and you were enjoying a delicious hamburger, and all of a sudden your friend said to you, well, actually, that hamburger didn't come from cows, it's made from golden retrievers. Chances are what you had just seen as food, you would now see as a dead animal or dead animals. What you had just felt was delicious, you would now feel is disgusting. And instead of continuing to eat that hamburger, you would probably throw it out. This is simply because you have not been conditioned by carnism to think of golden retrievers as food. You have a much more authentic response to the experience of that hamburger than you would have previously when you thought that that hamburger was made of cows. And these psychological defense mechanisms that I'm talking about, and I know we'll come back to this later, there are a number of them, but I'll just give you an example of one of them. I mean, I just gave you an example. This is the defense dissociation. You're dissociating from the experience that you're having. I'll give you one other example. Carnism teaches us to think of or to see farmed animals as abstractions, as lacking in any individuality or any personality of their own. So we learn, for example, to think that like a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. And so we don't feel the same connection with pigs, or certainly not with the idea of pigs that we do with dogs. With dogs, we recognize their individuality. So probably when you imagined eating that hamburger and then finding out it was a dog, you immediately thought of an individual being whose life, was now over. Whereas if you had thought it was from a cow or from another animal you'd learned to classify as edible, you wouldn't have had that thought. And so carnism really, and we'll come back to this, I know, throughout the interview, it informs the way that we relate to farmed animals. And it is, in my opinion, a big part of the root of the problem when we talk about, trying to change agriculture and trying to address the problems of animal agriculture. As long as we're all looking at the world through the lens of carnism, and we have this carnistic mentality that is causing us to feel defensive against anything that challenges to wake us up, it's going to be very hard to have a rational conversation about the issue. It's virtually impossible to have a rational or conversation about an issue when you're looking at the issue from the lens of the very system that wants you to continue thinking, feeling, and behaving in a certain way.
Why do people feel that some animals are pets and some are food?
Well, coming back to what I had just said, carnism teaches us to classify certain animals as edible and other animals we continue to see as inedible. And carnism is why, we can harbor very different attitudes and have very different feelings and behaviors toward different types of species.
Is there such a thing as humane meat? What if an animal is raised outside with lots of grass, nature, sunshine, and space to walk around?
And this idea of humanely produced carnistic products, what I call compassionate carnism, is really irrational, but it's only possible to appreciate just how irrational it is when we step outside of that carnistic box. So, for example, most of us would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever simply because people like the way her thighs taste. And yet, when this exact same thing is done to individuals of other species, we're taught to consider that humane. And in some ways, it might even be more problematic to slaughter the happy animal who has a life they want to continue living, and who perhaps has formed friendships and bonds with other individuals who will then grieve when this one is killed.
When trying to influence people to change their diet, should we say go vegan or should we say go as vegan as possible?
I always recommend asking people to be as vegan as possible. I mean, first of all, this is the only rational ask, right? Because nobody can do anything that's not possible. Nobody can do more than what's possible for them. And what's possible is what a person feels is possible for them. And so asking someone to be as vegan as possible is not only rational, it's also respectful. It's really important that we not make ourselves the experts on another individual's experience and place ourselves in a position of dictating what is and is not possible for them. We really have to allow people to be the experts on their experience. I had somebody once insist that I should be a fruitarian. And I kept saying, but it's not possible. And they said, but Melanie, it is possible. You live across the street from Whole Foods. This was when I still lived in the US. And they had all these reasons as to why it really was possible for me. So on a practical level, it was, but it didn't feel possible for me. So asking people to be as vegan as possible, also prevents this sort of all or nothing thinking that can make people throw up their hands and say, why bother even trying? The perfect really is in many ways the enemy of the good. It also reduces people's defensiveness against the ask. I mean, often many vegans will say, all I have to do is say I'm vegan and I feel like I'm hit by this wall of defenses, which is, of course, what carnism causes people to do, is to act defensive. But when we ask people to be as vegan as possible, they're a lot less defensive. And frankly, if everyone became as vegan as possible, the world would become vegan fairly quickly.
Do people understand how animals raised for food are treated? Is it important to educate people about this, or does it just create more resistance?
It's absolutely important to raise awareness about this issue. One of the ways that carnism keeps itself alive is by remaining invisible. If we can't see it, we can't challenge it. We can't think about it. We can't talk about it. We can't challenge it. So we absolutely need to make the reality of what's happening visible, and how we make the invisible visible matters very much. So many vegans or people who are working to raise awareness of animal agriculture, understandably recognize that most people's tendency is to turn away from images of animals suffering. Because getting back to what I said earlier, we care. Humans are hardwired to feel empathy. It hurts us to see them hurting. So the tendency is to look away. We need to help people become aware, and we need to honor this tendency to look away and the fact that seeing this reality can be traumatizing for people. And so the way that we share the information needs to be respectful and not creating more violence in the process. So a lot of times the vegans will try to shock people and say, gotcha, here it is. The problem with that is that many people can experience that behavior as a form of emotional violence, which it is, and can end up traumatized by it and then becoming angry at the vegan who they feel has victimized them, rather than angry at the real problem, which is the system and the businesses, the industries that are causing the suffering and the bloodshed in the first place. So I always recommend letting people know that you want to raise awareness, letting them know why it's important, getting their consent, and using as little imagery as possible. We don't need to bang people over the head to make them get it. It only takes a few seconds.
People are told eating animals is normal and natural and necessary. Is that really true? Why are these beliefs so accepted by so many people?
Yeah, well, I write about in my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, which is about carnism. I deconstruct the carnistic system and talk about the various carnistic defenses, one of which is justification. And the way that we learn to justify animals, I explain, is by learning to believe that the myths of meat, eggs, and dairy are the facts of meat, eggs, and dairy. We learn to believe in what I call the three N's of justification, that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. These arguments basically have been used to justify violent practices, of course, throughout human history, from male dominance to heterosexual supremacy. Most people do not realize, most people assume that beliefs that are so widespread, that are embraced and maintained by all major social institutions, that they must be facts rather than a widely held set of opinions. And so, a part of the work that we need to do, a big part of the work that we need to do, is to really raise awareness, not just of the consequences of animal agriculture, but also of the mentality, the system carnism that is at the root of some of these behaviors, the belief system that causes us to check our critical thinking at the door whenever conversations about eating animals come up.
If an animal isn't killed but is still forced to produce milk or eggs, is this still a problem?
Well, again, if we substitute an animal species who we haven't learned to become so desensitized toward, we might have a different response to this, or substitute a human being for this, right? So when we're talking about something like dairy production, when we think about forced impregnation, if we substitute another type of being for that, whether it's a dog or whether it's a cat or whether it's a human or a being who we have not been socialized to perceive as edible, as in this classification of animals, we can recognize that forcing somebody to become pregnant when it is not their choice, taking their baby away from them so that you can harvest their milk for yourself and your own species, and doing this again and again and again for the entire course of a lifetime, can never be not problematic.
What impact does animal agriculture have on the environment?
Well, fortunately, this conversation is happening more, this question is being asked more and more widely. The United Nations has said that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to some of the most serious problems facing the world today, facing the environment today, not the least of which, of course, is climate change. Animal agriculture is also a key driver of deforestation, desertification, fresh water depletion, and more.
Why should people have empathy for a pig, cow, or chicken? Do we even know if they care how they're treated?
Well, I think it's not a question of why people should have empathy for other animals, but we do have empathy for other animals. We know research has shown that we actually are hardwired to feel empathy for others. Most people cringe when faced with images of animal suffering, and those who don't are of concern. And we know this. So we do naturally feel empathy for others. We simply tend not to feel empathy for those animals we've been socialized to emotionally disconnect from through carnism. But even there, when we connect with an individual of one of these species, our natural empathy comes back. For example, we may go to petting zoos and pet the piglets before walking into the adjacent grocery store and buying bacon and ham. So most people know this. There's also ample evidence demonstrating the sentience of non-human beings, something that most people know intuitively. And thankfully, there's more and more research coming out demonstrating the sentience of fish and some crustaceans as well.
What's your prediction of where the vegan movement will be in 10 years?
I don't know where we're going to be in 10 years, to be honest. What I do see, however, and can speak to is that the trajectory of carnism, the direction that carnism as a system is heading in, is following the direction of, or the trajectory of other oppressive systems. So like, for example, patriarchy expressed through sexism or heterosexism, for instance. When a behavior becomes a choice, it takes on an ethical dimension it didn't have in quite the same way before. And for many people today, they're eating animals not because they have to, but because they choose to. Now, of course, some people are economically unable to make their food choices freely, or geographically unable to make their food choices freely. But for the people who can make their food choices freely, they appear to be becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of eating animals. When you look at, oppression and atrocities throughout human history, these atrocities were often largely made possible through getting the populace to believe that supporting the violence was necessary for survival of the nation, survival of, the gender, for example, survival of the race, that oppression was necessary in order to ensure the survival of one particular group. We no longer have the arguments to stand on that eating animals is necessary for human survival or even for human well-being. In fact, more and more evidence is mounting that just the opposite is true. And so carnism is becoming increasingly destabilized, not only because of this, evidence mounting of how problematic it is to be eating animals, but because of the connection between animal agriculture and climate change, and because there are more and more, options for people who don't want to eat animals anymore. There's more and more awareness thanks to the internet. So carnism is becoming increasingly destabilized, and veganism as an ideology and as a movement is really starting to flourish and take off. I don't know where we're going to be in 10 years, but I know we're heading in a great direction.
So if people see how animals are raised and killed, does that increase the chance of them becoming vegan?
It increases the chance of them becoming aware of something that runs counter to their values and that most people would not willingly support. So I would say yes. But as I said earlier, how they become aware, how they witness matters.
What prevents the food industry from becoming more healthy, conscious, and compassionate to animals, the planet, and people?
I mean, the food industry is, the industries are made up of people, and most people have inherited the carnistic mentality. And this is a mentality, as I said earlier, is organized around defenses and mythology, and it's reinforced over and over and over again, just about everywhere we turn throughout her entire lifetime, essentially. And so most people, of course, who are working in institutions are bringing this carnistic bias or this carnistic mentality with them. Carnism also conditions us to resist the very information that would help us get outside the box we don't even realize we're in. So when we encounter information that challenges our carnistic assumptions and beliefs, our biases, we tend to become resistant to that and to refute it. And you can see this in the way that people tend to respond to vegans and to communication about veganism. That said, people can and do change, and there is a shift. There is an increasing shift of awareness and of people in industries that are trying to work toward more vegan foods and more sustainable foods overall. That said, with industry, there's obviously also a vested interest in maintaining the carnistic status quo. There's it's big business. There's a lot of money to be made. More and more people who are advocating for healthier, more sustainable food choices are working with some of these companies to try to shift their production, not just what they're producing, but how they're producing foods and food products. So that's something to be hopeful about.
Why aren't politicians, the media, universities, the scientific community, and government agencies trying to stop factory farms, chemicals, and industries that cause climate change and environmental damage?
Well, I would say that they are actually. They are not, and they are. I mean, this is not a homogeneous group. There are more and more politicians. Where I live here in Germany, the Green Party is very active. There are a lot of people these days who are really working to change this problem from the inside out, from the inside of whatever sector they're working in. Nevertheless, systems like Carnism don't just roll over when they're challenged, they fight back. It's like a game of chess. There's move, counter move. So while there is a lot of work being done, bringing about positive change, there obviously is also a lot of resistance and pushback.
Has there been a societal thought that eating meat is manly and being a vegan is less manly? How has that thought changed in the last 20 years? And where did this thought even come from?
I mean, historically, meat has been associated with masculinity and a variety in a variety of ways. And ecofeminists, this is feminists who are focused on the intersection of feminism, animal rights, and ecological protection and ethics, talk about how there is this long-standing connection between masculinity and eating animals. And fortunately, this association is changing as more and more people become aware of many aspects of what we now recognize as toxic masculinity. This might makes right mentality. And this is really starting to shift what it means to be a real man. Historically, this idea of, at least in patriarchal societies, which is, most societies in the world today, boys and men learn that being a real man means exercising power and control over others. And recently, this conversation has been happening where people have been defining what it means to be a real man. Being a real man, there's sort of this shift from the mentality of a bully to the mentality of a hero, to the mentality of a collaborator. It's not about being a man, is not about using power, exercising power and control over others, but using your power in the best interest of others and yourself and the connections and communities that you're a part of.
Talk about contempt and shame, and what do these emotions tell us about how we are thinking and believe?
Well, contempt and shame are what I call two sides of the non-relational coin. And to understand what I mean by this, I need to unpack this a little bit. And I'm going to start by just talking about what shame is. Often we assume that shame and guilt are synonymous. They're the same thing. But even though we use these terms interchangeably, they're not the same. Guilt is how we feel about a behavior. We feel guilty when we think I did something bad. Shame is how we feel about ourselves. We feel shame when we think I am bad. Shame is the feeling of being less than. More specifically, it's the feeling of being less worthy than. When we feel shame, we feel a harm to our dignity. In other words, we feel that we believe and feel that we have less intrinsic worth, less of a right to be alive on this planet and to be treated with respect than others, some others or others. Shame is an incredibly demotivating, painful, destructive emotion. It's an incredibly prevalent emotion because we have all been born into a deeply relationally dysfunctional world. And we have all been born into this world where our collective level of relational literacy, the understanding of an ability to practice healthy ways of relating, is really low. We're still living in what I call the relational dark ages right now. So we have not learned how to relate to others and ourselves in a way that helps us to feel and honor our own dignity and the dignity of others, to feel connected, to feel secure, to have a fundamental sense of self-worth, that I am a worthy being. And so we carry around a lot of shame, and we're understandably very defensive against feeling shamed. And we tend to shame others in order to make ourselves feel better, because this is what our dysfunctional cultures have taught us to do very often. So I could go on and on about shame, but it's very much a problem. And it's a non-relational emotion because it reflects and reinforces relational dysfunction, a dysfunction in the way that we relate to others and also sometimes to ourselves. We can shame ourselves when we compare ourselves, for example, to an idealized version of ourselves. So the flip side of shame is contempt. So we feel shame when we feel less worthy than others. We feel contempt when we've placed ourselves in a position of moral superiority and we're looking down on others. When we feel contempt, we feel that we have more of a right. We have more worth than others do, more of a right to be treated with respect, essentially. And we can feel contempt toward ourselves too, because we're always relating to ourselves. Both of these are some of the most disconnecting of emotions. They disconnect us from others. They disconnect us from ourselves. When you feel shame, or even the threat of shame in somebody's presence, you will automatically disconnect from them because they're not a safe person for you to be emotionally open to. You will wrap yourself in the emotional armor necessary to protect yourself from being further shamed. When you feel contempt for somebody, you're essentially shaming them. They will disconnect from you and you won't feel connected to them because you're looking down on them and seeing them as less than. Both contempt and shame result from believing in a false narrative, believing in an illusion. The illusion that some individuals are more worthy of being treated with compassion, basically being treated with respect than others. And this belief is so widespread, it's so toxic, and it's so widespread that even the most well-intentioned of individuals will buy into it. And you can see this, people who are fighting for social, or working, I should say, for social justice, because they really believe in justice, people who are working for compassion for all beings will shame those who don't believe in that, believe what they believe. Because we have learned that you are only worthy of respect, if X, Y, or Z. So these are very problematic emotions. And when we recognize them for what they are, we're in a better position to navigate them. The antidote to both of them is the same, and that's empathy. It's impossible to look down on others or look up at them if we're looking at the world through their eyes.
So tell us more about empathy. How do we increase it towards people and animals?
Well, empathy is, it's an incredibly important emotion, an incredibly important practice is to feel empathy toward others. And it's also important to make sure that you have healthy boundaries around your empathy. Sometimes it's not safe to empathize with others. When people are not respectful towards you, when people have power over you, and I don't mean just in abusive relationships, when people aren't safe, those are people who you may want to be careful not to empathize with, certainly not to empathize too much with. Probably a number of people watching this are people who are high in empathy. They're sensitive to and tuned into some of the big problems in the world. And these people would probably benefit from really thinking about how they can shore up their empathy and have some more boundaries so that they have a clearer sense of where they end and others begin. So either way, whether you need to develop, exercise your empathy muscle more, or you need to pull your empathy in a little, either way, a practice that will help you do this is to develop your inner observer. Your inner observer is the part of you that's always been there, that always will be there, that is simply observing. It's within you. It's watching what happens without judgment, without making up a story. It's not that voice in your head that's chattering away, probably saying all sorts of not nice things about you and shaming you. It's just observing. Observe yourself as you move through your life and you move through the world. Your inner observer will grow with practice. And meditation is a great way to grow your inner observer. And you'll start noticing if you're feeling too much empathy or if you're not feeling enough empathy. Contempt and shame are red flags. If you feel contempt, that's a red flag that you've disconnected from your empathy. If you feel shame, that's a red flag that you have disconnected from your empathy for yourself, and that the person you're interacting with may not be a safe person for you to continue interacting with.
How do you see the dignity in other people, and why does it matter?
Well, dignity, as I said earlier, is one's sense of inherent worth, one's sense of fundamental worth. And so, simply recognizing that if you don't see dignity in others and in yourself, this is a reflection that you have bought into the narrative, the false narrative, that some individuals are more worthy of being treated with compassion or respect than others. So you notice it in its absence. And it matters because when we recognize the dignity in others, it helps to prevent us from acting in ways that may harm them emotionally or otherwise.
And thus, how do we create a more compassionate world?
Well, I very much believe that building relational literacy is fundamental to creating a more compassionate and just world. Relational literacy, as I said earlier, is the understanding of an ability to practice healthy ways of relating. When I always say that I'm amazed at how many of us, have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use. And yet we don't get a single formal lesson on how to have healthy relationships or how to communicate effectively. And when you think of some of the most pressing problems in our lives and also in our world, such as, emotional abuse and war, poverty, animal exploitation, climate change, racism, sexism, and so on, these are not problems that result from people who don't know how to do geometry. All of these problems share a common denominator, and that is relational dysfunction or dysfunctional ways of relating between social groups, between individuals, between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment, and even dysfunctional ways of relating with ourselves. So if a common denominator of these problems is relational dysfunction, then a common way, to solve or come and address these problems is building relational literacy. In a more relationally literate world, we would not be voting for toxic leaders. We would not be relating to farmed animals as though they're objects for our own consumption and exploitation. And we would not be relating to the environment in a way that is decimating it.
What was your book, Powerarchy, about, and why did you write it?
I wrote Powerarchy. Powerarchy is about the psychology of oppression and of abuse. Abuse is essentially oppression that's not institutionalized on a smaller scale. In this book, Powerarchy, I built on the theory I presented in my earlier book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, which was about Carnism. And I expanded my analysis of Carnism to all systems of oppression, essentially. And what I described is that I was looking at oppression not simply through the lens of moral philosophy or economics or politics, or not through these lenses, but rather through the lens of psychology, and in particular through the lens of relationships. And in this book, I talk about how oppression and abuse reflects and reinforces relational dysfunction, and how all oppressive systems and abusive systems and behaviors, these are like spokes on the wheel. They're spokes on a wheel because all of these systems have the same basic structure and they rely on the very same mentality. They're just different expressions of the same belief. And this is the belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, that some individuals or groups are more worthy of being treated with respect than others. And if you boil these systems down, this is really what's at their core in many ways. And so, and I talk about, in this book, I talk about the importance of recognizing oppression as relational dysfunction. And then I followed this up with another book, Getting Relationships Right, which focuses on building relational literacy.
What was your book, Beyond Beliefs, a guide to improving relationships and communications for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters about?
So this was a book I have two books on relationships, and this one is focused specifically on relationships between or among vegans and non-vegans, essentially, or vegetarians and meat eaters. I wrote this book because I had been very active in the vegan movement for a long time, for many years. I think it's going on 3 decades or something now. And I was hearing the same story all around the world when I was talking to vegans and often vegetarians as well, which was that becoming vegan was one of the most empowering experiences and important experiences of their lives. And yet their feeling of inspiration quickly turned to shock and horror when they discovered that their relationships and communication were breaking down because of this. And so because I had been working for a number of years as a relationship coach, and this is sort of like another hat that I had worn, I really wanted to wed these two aspects of my life. And to provide some guidance for people in veg, non-veg relationships, essentially, and to talk about, really the principle of the principles and tools for healthy relationships, but also specifically when you're in a mixed relationship or even in a vegan relationship, because some of the psychology that you inherit, some of the problems that you have to deal with as a vegan can express themselves in unique ways. I wanted to give people tools for navigating these relationship differences.
You mentioned your book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, an introduction to Carnism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you wrote it?
Yeah, I wrote that. That was based on my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating animals, the psychology of carnism. And it was my doctoral research that led me to identify the system that I then came to call carnism, and to deconstruct that system. And so Why We Love Dogs, I wrote 10 years ago. The 10th anniversary edition came out in 2020. And it was basically a presentation of this theory. It's not written in academies, of course. It's written for a lay audience.
What should you do if you want to eat a vegan diet and your partner or family doesn't?
Well, very often, many people in this position really struggle, understandably, for many reasons. And they believe that the solution, if I'm in a relationship with a non-vegan, the solution is to get them to go vegan. Often this is challenging because sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest ones to advocate to. And of course, close relationships are not even a forum, really an appropriate forum for advocacy. What many vegans find is that when they ask people in their lives to go vegan, they get resistance. People often don't want to be asked to change. When they ask people, nevertheless, to become vegan, what I call vegan allies, they receive much less resistance. And this can really be a game changer for the relationship. So a vegan ally is a supporter of veganism and of vegans, even though they're not fully vegan themselves. In relationships, with any degree of closeness anyway, we need to be allies to one another. You need to know the person you're close to understands you and has your back, and they're going to be respectful of you and your beliefs. And that they are going to understand your inner world. It's impossible to have a truly connected relationship with someone if that other person doesn't really understand, to some degree, your inner world. And many vegans move through the world feeling very invisible and very frustrated, particularly in their closer relationships, because their experience is unseen. And I recommend to vegans to say to the people in their lives, look, I would love to share, I want to share information about veganism with you and about animal agriculture with you, not to get you to go vegan, but so you understand me, so you get what the world looks like through my eyes, because you know what, central to who I am in so many ways. If you don't understand it and you don't understand why I feel the way I do, you'll never understand me, and you will very likely do things that cause me to feel disconnected from you, and I don't want to feel disconnected from you. And so many vegans find that when the people in their lives become allies, supporters, I get it, hey, I'm not there myself, but I get you, I respect you for what you're doing, this can be a game changer for relationships.
Is lab grown meat a great solution to the problem of killing animals and destroying the environment?
Well, often people who are advocating veganism believe that it's really, we've got to change people's attitudes. We've got to make people, get people to make the connection, see what's happening to the animals and the environments and be motivated for purely ethical reasons. But these arguments, or I should say approaches, they don't speak to many people. There are many people, I should say, that they don't speak to. Behavioral change can and does often precede attitudinal change. So what this means is that when people first change their behaviors, they're more likely to be able to change their attitudes, and the attitudinal change can follow that. When people are no longer eating animals, actually eating animals and supporting that industry, the industry of carnism, or of animal agriculture, I should say, they're much less defensive against information about the issue because there's nothing left to defend. So anything that we can do to get people to reduce their consumption of animals, I think, is a step in the right direction, as long as obviously this new behavior doesn't cause new victims or other victims.
Do you feel as strongly about the treatment and killing of fish as you do about cows, pigs, and chickens?
I don't think the issue is really as much a matter of feeling as much as it's a matter of like, what strategically can we do to reduce harm as much as possible? This is, carnism it's a catastrophe. It's an ethical, it's an ecological, and it is an absolute catastrophe. And my question is always, what can we do to reduce the harm as much as possible, as quickly as possible? Obviously, ethically. And I think, when I come at the question, or this question with that question in mind, I feel very strongly about the treatment and killing of fish. Number one, we know that fish, there's plenty of research demonstrating that fish are in fact sentient beings. They're other animals. They're animals like we are, who have lives that matter to them and who have pain receptors. So this is one thing. Also, when we think about what we can do to do less harm, eating fewer of the animals who are consumed in larger quantities is often a more effective means to reducing harm. So, for example, if we, the average non-vegan consumes far more chickens and probably far more fish, individual fish, maybe I should say fishes, in a year than they do cows, because cows are much larger animals. It takes, one animal to feed a non-vegan for, I don't know how long it is, like a month or so, 2 months, where multiple fish, you could easily eat 5 fish a week or 10 fish or fishes a week.
What would be the most powerful things someone can do to help with the mistreatment of animals, climate change, and the destruction of our planet?
Yeah, I don't know, what the most powerful thing is, but one powerful thing people can do is to use their influence to reduce support for animal agriculture, which is a primary cause of all of the things that you mentioned. This may well involve not eating animals, but it also can involve much more than that. Often people who are advocating veganism, understandably, yet I believe mistakenly, assume that, what we really need to do is just get people to go vegan, go vegan. And that is great. I totally support this. And at the same time, there's a lot more that people can do besides just going vegan. People can be not only as vegan as possible, they can also be vegan allies that use their influence to help in the transformation of carnism. Some of the people who have done most for this cause, in my experience, are not vegan, and they're not even vegetarian. They're vegan allies. They are reporters from major publications who interview me and get stories that run and reach hundreds of thousands of people around the world. There are people who donate to my organization Beyond Carnism that's completely dependent on donations, who are not vegan themselves, but who really want to help us do the work that we're doing to help create a more vegan world. So whoever you are, whatever you do, you can become a part of this transformation by using your influence in the best way you can to help further the cause. And this is a cause that really needs all the help it can get.
For someone looking for advice on creating a healthy relationship You've mentioned some of this. Do you think vegans should marry a meat eater, or should they look for vegan?
Yeah, well, I think most important is to choose a partner who's healthy. Very often we assume that it's the differences in our relationships that cause the problems, and differences obviously do bring with them the potential for problems. But more important than the differences between us often is how we relate to those differences. When you choose somebody who's committed to relational health, and who's relatively relationally healthy, many people find that they can navigate these complicated or seemingly complicated ideological differences. And I talked about building relational literacy earlier. I feel very strongly, very obviously very strongly about the need to do this and the need to promote this for any of us, anyone who really wants to help create a better world. I believe would do well to have as their meta mission, as their overarching mission, to create a more relational world, because that's what we're asking people to do, is to change the way that we relate. And if we don't do this more directly, we can end up just trading one form of oppression for another. So you have people who change the way they relate to farmed animals, they stop eating them, and nevertheless they're abusive or unkind to people who don't believe in them. And they're then feeding the same mentality that needs to be transformed if we ever hope to have the kind of world that we all say, and I believe want to live in. I had mentioned before my second most recent book is called Getting Relationships Right, and it's a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. And there are a number of tools, principles and tools for building relational literacy, but they all stem from the very same formula. And the formula is: you practice integrity and honor dignity. That's it. And this leads to a sense of mutual connection and security. So practicing integrity means simply acting in alignment with your core values of compassion and justice. It's treating somebody else with respect. When you honor dignity, you honor their inherent worth. When you practice integrity and you honor dignity, this leads to a sense of connection between you and a sense of greater security between you. This one formula lies at the foundation of relational health. I call this the foundation, the formula for relational health. It applies to how we treat other animals, how we treat the environment, how we treat ourselves, how we treat other individuals, how social groups interact. And this formula applies to brief interactions, how you relate to the cashier at the grocery store when you're paying for your groceries, as well as to long-term relationships. And it also exists on a spectrum. It's not that, this is a healthy interaction or it's an unhealthy or dysfunctional interaction. It can be more or less so. So on one end of the spectrum are, these healthy behaviors I'm talking about. On the other end of the spectrum are dysfunctional. These are the behaviors and attitudes I call non-relational attitudes and behaviors, right? And they're exactly the opposite. A non-relational behavior is one that violates integrity and harms dignity. And this leads to us feeling disconnected and insecure. And if you think about your own experience, any experience you might have, or any relationship you're in, you can see that this formula applies. If you think about a good relationship you have, you probably believe that person will practice integrity toward you. They'll treat you with respect. You feel that they honor your dignity when they're interacting with you. They're not looking down on you. And you probably feel connected with them and more secure in their presence. And if you think about not such great relationships, you probably recognize that this other person is violating integrity when they interact with you. They're harming your dignity by not perceiving you as being worthy of being treated with respect. And you feel disconnected from them and less secure in their presence. And so we can apply this formula basically universally. And that's one of the things that makes it so handy. And so anybody who's wanting to create a better world, a more compassionate and just world, in my opinion, needs to be committed to building relational literacy and to helping people recognize and be better able to practice this formula.
Should vegans consider themselves better, smarter, or more conscious than non-meat eaters? Should they feel moral superiority?
Yeah, so bringing us back to what I was talking about before, when we place ourselves in a position of moral superiority, we are buying into the false narrative, the illusion, that there's some hierarchy of moral worth, that some individuals are more worthy of moral consideration, being treated with respect, morally better than others. And this is an illusion. I mean, just like it's not rational, for example, for a wealthy, white, US-born man to believe that the reason he's more successful, or even just more financially successful than, say, a woman who was born into poverty in El Salvador and who works in a factory. It's not rational for him to believe that the reason he's more successful is because there's something in him that made him better. It's the same thing when it comes to a sense of moral superiority. We are all nothing more nor less than the hard wiring that we've been born with in every single experience we've had every second of our lives. We are the composite of all of these different factors. And it's really important to recognize that to feel compassion is a privilege. If you're in a position where you can feel compassion for others, and then you have the privilege of being able to act on that, that is an incredible gift that you should be very grateful for, the same way that wealthy man should be very grateful for the privileges that entitled him to achieve the kind of success that he did, rather than looking down on people who aren't as successful. So often advocates perceive those who are not advocates or not behaving in the way they want them to behave as somehow less ethically or morally successful. But this is the very same mentality that drives entitlement and that drives privilege. And just think about, like, in your own life, think about one bad experience or one bad day that you have. You're stuck in traffic, everything's going wrong, you're on economy in a flight, your knees are squished up under your chin, you're getting like shoved from all sides, you're late, you're missing your meeting. It doesn't take much to get to the point where it's really hard for you to be your better self. And you really suddenly start not liking who you are and not treating people in a way that you would really like to be able to treat them. It doesn't take much for most people to get to this point where we get snappy and not nice and selfish. And we start focusing on our own self-preservation rather than on expressing compassion toward others. We lose the capacity to feel other-centered because we're suffering so much ourselves. So when you have that capacity to be other-centered and to feel and express compassion toward others, be very grateful for that gift you were given, and don't look down on people who don't have the same gift that you do.
Aside from diet, should we avoid buying leather sneakers, shoes, belts, handbags, and cars with leather seats?
I prefer to avoid the word should, and rather talk about, talk about growing awareness and encouraging people. I would say I would encourage people to continue to grow their awareness, right? So aside from diet, it's important to continue to learn about the ways that your consumption choices and other choices as a just a citizen of this planet, right, are impacting others, and to the degree that is sustainable for you. Again, I said earlier, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So it's really important also, as you're evolving in your awareness of your choices and what your choices mean and the ramifications of those choices on others, it's also important to recognize what's sustainable for you and to not push yourself too hard. And there are so many alternatives and ways to get around this, right? You could say, I can't give up leather shoes, but then you start buying used leather shoes. So you're not contributing to, animal factories, for example. People sometimes ask me where I draw my line around my circle of compassion, because I don't wear animal products. And this was a process for me. It was sort of, one thing at a time. And eventually I became as vegan as I am now, and which is not wearing animal products and eating animal products, or I should say carnistic products. And when people would ask me, where do you draw your line around your circle of compassion? I would answer, it's not where I draw my line that matters, it's how I relate to my line. Do I reflect on my line? Do I ask myself if I'm moving along that spectrum to practicing greater integrity? Am I working toward greater relationality in my choices that impact others and myself?
How does the way we treat animals impact how humans treat other humans?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when we think about the formula that I talked about before, non-relational behaviors versus relational behaviors, both of these are contagious. Studies have shown that non-relational behaviors, what they would call toxic communication, for example, or toxic workplace behaviors, are contagious. In fact, researchers say that they spread like the common cold. So you think about, somebody flips you off in the car, for example, when you're driving, and then you're more likely to do something like that to somebody else down the road, or you're more likely to snap at your partner when you get home later on. So there's this, these behaviors tend to reproduce themselves. So what this means is that compassion begets compassion. And I would say this works both ways. It's not just how we treat animals influences how we treat humans, but how we treat humans also can influence how we treat animals. The more we water the seeds in ourselves of compassion, the more likely we are to grow compassion in ourselves and to practice compassion more universally. All of that said, humans have a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize, a remarkable ability to compartmentalize. And so we really also need to be committed to thinking about applying the formula I talked about before as universally as possible.
Is there a hierarchy of moral worth, and what does that mean?
So this is what I was speaking to earlier when I said that this is the belief that lies at the core of oppressive and abusive non-relational behaviors. This belief that certain individuals or groups are more worthy of being treated with compassion or respect than others.
What do you say to the people who feel fighting for veganism, organic, and the environment is a lonely fight that makes them feel rejected and judged by parts of society?
I would say that there is some truth in that. And I would say that it's also true that they are a part of something that is much greater than their individual selves. They are part of a movement for social transformation that is, I believe, going to be looked back upon one day as one of the most important movements for transformation in human history. And it is linked with many other important movements for social transformation. So when you start to feel lonely, just remember that you are a part of something greater than your individual self, and what you do matters.
How do you get non-vegans to learn about veganism?
Well, we can't really get people to do things or make people do things. That's what legislation is for, which is, kind of forcing change. But when we're talking about advocacy, us as individuals promoting veganism, what we can do is we can communicate and relate. And communication is the primary way we relate, right? So we can communicate or relate in a way that increases the chances that our message will be heard as we intend it to be. And in order to do that, it's really, really important to learn the principles and tools for effective communication. Really important. It's a game changer, just like relational literacy is a complete game changer. It changes so much in your life. So anybody who's struggling, and especially people who are promoting, advocating veganism, they know what it feels like to say the same thing 30 different ways and it still doesn't get in, and to feel like you're screaming into a vacuum and just come up against this wall of defenses over and over and over again. The more you build your communication skills, the less you're going to have those experiences, and the more your life is going to probably transform for the better. Everybody needs, in my opinion, to learn effective communication skills. I said earlier, we just don't we're not taught this basic life skill. But people can come to our website, carnism.org or veganadvocacy.org. We have a lot of materials, a lot of free materials there for people. And two of my books are focused on effective communication and building relational literacy. So really work to hone those skills. And people still might not still might resist your message because carnism conditions people to be resistant. However, you'll spend a lot less time saying the same thing over and over and over again, and you'll be a lot more likely to create the kind of openness and connection you're looking for.
So you talk a lot about effective communication. What is toxic communication, and what does this have to do with vegans?
Well, toxic communication is basically non-relational communication. Communication is the primary way we relate. So communication is a form of relating. Toxic communication is essentially communicating in a way that runs counter to the formula I shared with you before. So it's communicating in a way that violates integrity and harms dignity and leads to disconnection and insecurity. And when we have not really been taught how to communicate effectively and worked on this, we're very likely going to be communicating in a way that's toxic, because that's often the default, especially when we feel defensive, and especially about issues where, the stakes are high, no pun. But where, so many vegans, feel the urgency of our message. We care so much. We recognize the problem is so huge. We're awake in the midst of this global atrocity. And we are, because we care so much, we work so hard to open hearts and minds. And because we care so much, sometimes working so hard to open hearts and minds can cause us to come across as more pushy than we want to be. And we come up against all of these defense mechanisms, and that makes our job very, very hard. So really, and then we can default to toxic communication. Of course, many vegans communicate in a way that's toxic with each other because we care so much, in part, and because vegans are people, and people who haven't really worked on developing their inner observer and learning how to relate in a way that's healthy are probably going to default to the dysfunctional norm that we've been born into.
Why was it important for you to come speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
I think, people are here at this conference, hosting this conference because they really care. They care. People are here because they care about helping to create a better world. They care about making decisions that are in the best interest of themselves and others and the planet. They care about building awareness so that they can make a positive contribution to what they believe in and to their own lives. And so I wanted to be here. I think it's important to be here, to be a part of this conversation, to raise awareness about the particular issues that I've spoken about, hopefully to provide some ideas and some tools for people who are obviously caring and working to help make the world a better place.
Well, you've certainly done that. We so appreciate your work. It is incredibly meaningful for all of us. And we thank you. We hope you keep it up. We want more. And thank you for being so gracious with your time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for being so gracious and putting this on and making it so accessible for people.
You bet. Thank you. Be well, Melanie. Take care.
You too.